Let's pray. Heavenly Father, would you let us see that perfect love that casts out all fear? Would you let us experience that this morning? And so open up our eyes, Lord, that we might clearly see you, Jesus, in whose name we pray. Amen. One of the opportunities I get as a pastor, it really is a joy when you get a chance to marry people and be a part of those great ceremonies. And what I encourage people to do, in fact, I insist on it if I'm doing the wedding, is we do premarital counseling. And this is just a little aside. If you find yourself in a season where you're thinking about getting married, here's just a free little tidbit or somebody you can pass on to somebody before they get engaged. I would say the best time to do premarital counseling is before you even get engaged. That is the best time to do that, because my experience has been when you start getting into premarital counseling and you're already engaged and that wedding train is moving right smack down the road, there's almost no stopping that no matter what you find in counseling and doing that. So I want to encourage anybody, do that beforehand, because this couple that I'm going to tell you about now, and we'll give you their names, that happened a number of years ago, that they were sitting in my office, and I didn't really know them very well. They very rarely came to church, but they wanted to get married, and so they came and we sat down, and often I have just some general questions like, hey, where did you meet, and what do you guys enjoy doing together? But as I was sitting with them and sort of reflecting on what kind of icebreaker kind of question do I want to ask, the question came into my mind, and I thought, I'm not sure I want to ask that. That seems a little too deep to start with, but it just when God puts something in your mind, every once in a while I'll just reflect on it for a moment and go, okay, God, I'll trust you, and go with it. And I asked them, I said, so why do you want to marry each other? And she started and went right in, because evidently she had thought a lot about that question, and she waxed eloquent about all the different characteristics that he had and how he filled all these characteristics. She'd been journaling and praying about this all her life, and it saw all these characteristics, and boy, he fulfills these, and here's the reason I think we really are good together, and I'm looking forward to building these things, and we share these values together, and went on for several minutes talking about him and the significance of that. So then I turned to him and asked him that same question, well, why do you want to marry her? And I could see just by the question, he shouldn't have been caught off guard, but he was caught off guard. He didn't really know what to say in that moment, and what he said, he's like, well, she's really cool. And I thought, man, dude, you better come up with something better than she's really cool, because that's not a really good way to start this. But then I could see there was something behind, like when you look into somebody's eyes and you know there's something more, but they're not ready to let that out. And I said, so why do you really want to be with her? And you could tell that he was a little anxious, and he said, you know what, I just don't want to be alone. I thought, wow, okay, that's honest, and I appreciate that, and let's dig into that a little bit. And so I said, you know what, there is something worse than being alone. It's being alone in a relationship. And so you really have to dig at some of those things in your own life to get rid of those things, because otherwise you make the false assumption that anybody can fit and everybody's a good partner in that relationship. It's sort of like this picture, that anybody can fit on the swing. I don't care who it is. I just need somebody on that swing, because I don't want to be all alone. And the world is full of lonely marriages today because we've allowed anybody to fit in to that category. And so as I think through that, I think through an article I read in the New York Times, I think it was back in January, and it said over in England now they have a minister of loneliness. Did you read about this? They've actually now hired a minister of loneliness to deal with the loneliness epidemic over in the UK, and it came from a study where they found over 9 million people who live in the UK say they either are overwhelmed or extremely lonely. And so that's 9 million people out of those living in the UK, and from a percentage standpoint, that's like 14% of the population. And so they decided this is an epidemic enough where we need to speak into this and study this and discover what can we do to help people. And so when I read through that, it just then dawned on me, I'm like, I wonder what happens on our side of the pond. What's going on in terms of loneliness here in America. And I came across this statistic. It's not the same study, so it's not apples to apples, but it's close enough. 1 in 5 Americans suffer from persistent loneliness. That's 20% of the people in America, as they are surveyed, suffer from persistent loneliness. Now, that is sort of hard to believe in our technological world where you can pick up a phone today and talk to anybody on the face of this planet. You can Skype somebody and see their face halfway across the world and communicate with people. You've got Facebook and hundreds and thousands of friends on Facebook. How is it that the majority, or 1 out of 5 people in America suffer from persistent loneliness? And lest we think, by the way, this is just an old problem, like, oh, this happens when somebody passes away and they miss their spouse, and those are the ones who are chronically lonely. The number one age category for persistent loneliness is between 18 and 22. That Generation Z, as they are defined by some. Those are the people who are feeling more lonely than anybody else. It's an epidemic in our world today. And so I think it's probably good to at least define loneliness, because you're like, how can you be lonely? We're all connected around the globe. That doesn't make sense. Well, here's a definition of loneliness. Loneliness is perceived social isolation. So you can be at a large school. You can live in a large community. You can have a large family and still have perceived social isolation. That's really what loneliness is. That's where loneliness comes from. And I want to ask a question, and I don't want to just jump right over this, but I started with this when we were putting the series together. I thought, is loneliness bad? I wrote in the margin of my paper as I was just studying and reflecting. Is loneliness really bad? And it's easy to jump over that and say, of course loneliness is bad. It's painful. It must be bad. And really, I'm not sure it is, because I think there are some good things that can come out of loneliness. For instance, loneliness teaches us how to live in community. Loneliness teaches us how to live in community. I don't know if any of you had this experience growing up like I did. I was playing baseball in our neighbor's yard, which is right next to ours, and we had a whole bunch of kids in the neighborhood, and we're playing baseball, and inevitably, you know, what happens is there's some disagreement. I'm safe. No, you're out. Safe, out, safe, out. And you go back and forth until finally somebody gives in, or you just do like it's a do-over. Well, evidently I was stubborn enough, and whoever else was the other person was stubborn enough, and we were not moving. Like, that was it. And so I was frustrated at that moment. I didn't know what I was going to do as a little boy. And so I literally, like, it's my ball. I'm going to pick up my ball, and I'm going to go home. And so I picked up my ball, and I marched home, and I went through the backyard, into our backyard, opened up the back door, walked in the backyard, went up into my room upstairs, and my room overlooked our backyard and our neighbor's backyard. And what I expected to see was a whole bunch of miserable kids in the neighborhood, like, oh, no, we really, like, I don't know what we're going to do. We got to apologize to John. I don't know. And I don't know what I was thinking, like there's no other baseballs in the world, because what happened is they went and found another baseball, and they just continued the game without me. And so I'm sitting up there in a room as a little kid going, wait a minute, I don't think this worked out like I had planned at all. Maybe there's a better way to do this. I'm up here all by myself, miserable, and they're out having a good time. And I tell you, I will remember that until the day I die, that there is a better way to go through life, that you have to work through difficulty and conflict, and it's okay. That loneliness teaches us how to live into community. And this is what the writer of Ecclesiastes has to say. If either of them falls down, if there are two people, one can help the other up. But if anyone who falls and has no one to help them up, man, pity that person who falls and has no one to lift him up. Isn't that just a beautiful picture from the Old Testament, that they knew this really intuitively? This is what life is. That it's blessing to have other people around you, to live in community, so that when you fall down, when you get discouraged, when somebody stomps on you, when you feel like you can't go on, that there are some other people to come alongside and lift you up. But conversely, what I like about this as well is for any of you who have ever gone through recovery, or had a family member or a close friend gone through recovery, you know this is also true. Because so often, instead of being codependent and just allowing people to continue in their brokenness and their sinfulness and whatever it is that their addiction is you can say, you know, no longer are you welcome to be here anymore. You can't live here anymore. We're not going to support you anymore. We're not going to allow you to continue in this lifestyle. And the hope of that is, while on the outside that looks really mean, what is that? That's really a loving thing to do, because what you're hoping to have done is eventually they get down to that bone-crushing loneliness where they're isolated and by themselves with their addiction. And hopefully that God in that moment can speak into that and look around you. There's nobody around you. Maybe you want to do something different. And it's often when they hit that rock bottom, as some people call it, that it's that loneliness that draws them out of that. So loneliness has a good purpose, and it has a reason for that. But what really does this? Well, I found this great little quote from American Psychological Association, because loneliness can be dangerous too, by the way. Loneliness and social isolation may represent a greater public health hazard than obesity. Man, that's a little frightening to think about, that this epidemic of loneliness that we have is more a greater health risk than obesity. Another scientist was studying this. He said it's worse than smoking 16 cigarettes a day, the chronic loneliness to your health. And I had no idea, because I don't smoke cigarettes. I had no idea, like, is that a pack a day? I didn't know. And so I go to, like, Siri, because that's what you do, right? If you don't know the answer to that, I'm like, I don't know. Is that a pack of cigarettes a day? So I asked Siri, but I'm like, I don't want to do this real loud, because I was home, and my daughter was home, and I didn't want her thinking, like, oh, Dad's smoking now. I don't know what's going on. So I'm, like, real quiet with Siri, like, how many cigarettes are in a pack of cigarettes? And do that. And unfortunately, like, my volume was up on my phone, and then Siri answers the question. In a typical American pack of cigarettes, there are 20 in a pack of something. Like, oh, thank you, Siri, for that. That's wonderful news. Then I had to tell my daughter, here's what I was studying for a sermon. That's what I was doing. Honey, I'm not trying to pick up smoking. That's what I'm doing. It's amazing, the epidemic that is going on. But what's the cause behind the chronic loneliness? As I wrestled with that and read about that and studied about that, I really came up, I think, that one of the number one ways loneliness grows is when we ruminate over lies. That we just hear these lies over and over again. And where do these lies come from? Well, sometimes they come from bullying. Boy, that's certainly popular today. You know, it used to be back in the day. Remember, you could go home from school and sort of leave school, but now you never really leave school because you're connected with school all the time through social media and all the things that are going on. And so bullying is an epidemic where just constantly you're bombarded with lies that people are telling you. Or to go back to our Spider series, some of you remember the lies that you were spoken to from all your life, or maybe from your childhood that you've been carrying for so long, and so you still hear those sounds and voices of those lies from so long ago. And the more we ruminate about those, the more that gets us isolated into loneliness. Sin brings us into loneliness, because sin's natural tendency is to hide in shame. And so then we isolate ourselves. And what do we do when we isolate ourselves? Well, then we're lonely. And that's another lie, that, oh, nobody wants to be around you. If they really knew what you were doing, they wouldn't want to be around you at all. And so loneliness grows when we ruminate over those lies. And so what do you do when you start hearing those kind of things in your life? And I was trying to think of a character in the Bible that would really help bring this point home. And I thought of Job. And for those of you who don't know anything about Job, that's a book in the Old Testament. And Job, it said, was one of the richest men ever on the face of the earth. And they had this little dialogue between God and Satan. And Satan says, well, of course Job worships you, God. He's got everything. Take that away and he won't worship you anymore. God says, all right, go ahead, take it away from him. And one catastrophe after another, and everything is gone in Job's life, and he's still worshiping God. God said, see, it wasn't about stuff. He just worships me because he worships me. He said, well, he's still got his health. You take his health away, surely he won't worship. Fine, you can't take his life, but you can let him suffer a little bit, and he begins to suffer. And in that suffering, then, most of the book of Job is these characters, these friends of his that come alongside him. And what you need to know about that culture in that day was they really believed in karma. If you had something bad happen to you, it's because you did something bad. And so instead of coming alongside of Job and going, oh my goodness, I can't imagine what happened to you. Can we support you? Can we encourage you? Can we come alongside you? Can we lift you up? Is there some needs that we can fulfill for you? Instead of doing that, they nitpick at his life and say, Job, this must be it. How about this? Have you ever done this or this? And they're constantly bombarding his life. And finally, Job has enough. And look at what he says in Job chapter 13, verses 4 and 5. You, however, smear me. He's talking to his friends. You smear me with lies. You are worthless physicians, all of you. If only you would be altogether silent. For you, that would be wisdom. Some of you are like writing down that verse now. Like, I got to write that one down. I'm going to remember that verse, and I'm going to pull that one out later. Now, the danger with pulling that verse out later is that's a natural tendency when we hear people bombarding us with stuff. And I remember a professor of mine back in the seminary, and he says, boy, you will get attacked as a pastor. You will get critiqued a lot as a pastor, and you just have to get used to that after a while. But he said, instead of just pushing people off or quoting a verse like this and just negating everything they have to say, take a moment and pray and say, God, what is that kernel of truth in the midst of all that, regardless of how venomous and how angry and hurtful their words are? What is that kernel of truth that I can take a hold of? Because the truth of the matter is even in the midst of that, even when we want to push aside everything that's been spoken to us, we still have to face our own brokenness. Because all of us are broken, and we'd love to push all those words aside and not listen to any negative criticism or critique. But sometimes we need to hear those words of truth spoken over our lives, because all of us are broken, and we still have to face our brokenness. And frankly, at this point, what I realize is that's about as enough bad news as I can take in one message. It's hard enough for me to get through this part of it. So I thought I want to shift gears and just emotionally go through okay, what do we do with that now? We get the idea. There's a chronic deal with isolation and loneliness in our world today, and we have to address that. What does God have to say about this? And frankly, there's one truth that really sounds very sophomoric, but man, this is one we have to get our minds around, and it's simply this, that we are really never alone. There's never really a time in our lives where we are completely alone. And I tell you, the first time I really grasped this concept, I guess I knew it because I grew up in church, but I never really comprehended that until I was working at Little Caesars. And there was a lot of times that I was alone. As a 16-year-old kid, our store didn't have the volume where we had multiple employees unless it was a rush, dinner rush or anything like that. So most of the time, after 8 until closing the store, you were there by yourself, which isn't a very good business model, but that's sort of what they did. So here's me as a 16-year-old kid in charge of the store. And one of the things you had to do at the end of the night was to take all the money. And this was back in the 80s, way before credit cards, that everything was pretty much cash. And so you'd take all the cash, stick it in a little envelope, shut the envelope up, and you'd go walk across the street, which was right next door to the store I was working at, and drop the night deposit in the box late at night. And during the week, we'd close at 11 o'clock at night. And so you'd be there by yourself, and here I am, 16-year-old kid with a whole bunch of cash in my hand walking over to bank. I look at that, I'm like, I don't know who thought that was a good idea, but that was evidently a good idea. And so one night I'm working there, and it's late, but we were pretty slow the rest of the night. And I'd cleaned everything, prepped everything for the next day, had gotten everything done, and I'm just waiting for 11 o'clock to hit. Now, I had a lot of people that I knew that used to just shut down the store early. We're just going to close early. If nobody's here, that's fine. We're going to do that. But as my wife would attest to, I'm a rule follower. I like to follow rules, and this is one of those things. You don't close until 11 o'clock. And I remember, the voice, go lock the door. It's 10 minutes to 11. No, I'm not closing early. Go lock I'm not locking the door early. I'm not cheating. I'm not doing that. Anybody else can do that. I'm not going to be one of those people. And literally, I could feel just this presence pushing me toward that. I'm like, fine, I'm going to lock it, but if somebody comes, I'm unlocking it. And if the phone rings, I'm answering it, and we're going to make a pizza. I don't care if everything's cleaned already, and that's fine, whatever. And so I get back around to the counter. I'm looking out the front window, and no sooner did I get there that a guy runs up with a big ski mask and a big old hunting knife, and he grabs a hold of the door, and it's locked, and he sort of looks, and then he runs off. I'm like, man, my heart is pounding out of my chest in that moment of time. I'm like, man, I don't know what to do. And I run over and I grab the phone and I call the police department. And the police were over there in a heartbeat. And that might have had something to do with the fact that we always gave the policemen free pizza all the time. But man, they were there. Within seconds, they were there, and several cars with sirens and things. Hey, what did you see, and what's going on? I'm like, I don't know. Did he have a car? No, I didn't see him. How tall was he? I think about this tall, and had a ski mask on. He was wearing this, and do all the description, and had a guy casing, looking all over the place and going through the neighborhood. And he's like, are you ready to go now? Do you want us to take you? I'm like, well, I got to go to the bank. And he looks at me like, you got to take money to the bank this late at night? I'm like, yeah, that's what we're supposed to do. So he walks me over. I get an escort to the bank. He walks me over. I put the deposit in. I go back, and he's like, where do you live? I'm like, I live about 3 miles away. We'll follow you home. We'll give you an escort home. And so there's a cop car behind me. I've never felt better about a cop car behind me in my whole entire life. Been driving all the way home, and I hope my mom is not looking out the window, because that's got to be disheartening when you see a police car behind your son driving home and get in there. And it didn't dawn on me till later that I know who was the one pushing me to lock that door. That was the presence of God. And I thought, man, how good is our God? That just in that moment, John is not bright enough to figure this out by himself, so you just need to go down there, angel, and push him toward the door if he's not going to lock it. Okay, whatever. And I locked the door. That was completely one of those moments where God says, you're never alone, John. I see all the details of your life. I know what's happening, and I see these things. And there's going to be moments where I don't intervene, and there's going to be moments I do intervene, but I am always with you. We are never completely alone. And so this is what Hebrews says. I love this verse. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. And you can walk away from God, but God's promise is always certain. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. Even if you forsake me, I won't do that. And so it reminds us, don't get caught up in money and put your trust in money, because money will forsake you. Your stuff, what you have, will forsake you, but I will never forsake you. I will never leave you. Stuff leaves. Money leaves. God never, ever leaves. You are never completely alone. And at this point, this would be easy for us to say, well, that's great. I just need me and God, right? That's all I need. As long as I got God, I'm good. That's all I don't really need anybody else. And this is very typical. I hate to say male kind of thing, but this is that male bravado. I don't need anybody else in my life. And nothing could be farther from the truth. Because while us and God, that's a great thing. That is our primary relationship. God doesn't call us to just be with him. God calls us out and calls us into community. He calls us out of isolation. He calls us out of loneliness and calls us into relationship. God calls us out. And the reason I know this is because I've had the privilege and honor of being at people at their bedside when they transition from this life and go to be in the presence of Jesus. And I tell you, in those beautiful, serene kind of moments, I've never, ever had a single person say, you know what, Pastor, thank you so much for being here, but you know what I'd appreciate? If you would just give me and my car a little time alone, because I'd just like to spend a little bit of time with my car before I go, or my bass boat. Could you bring my bass boat into the hospital with me so I can have a little time alone with that, or my big screen TV, or whatever it is that you seem to be attached to? Who do we want in those moments, right? We want the relationships around us. All of us need this. God calls us out of that. Look at what the psalmist writes. God sets the lonely in families. God sets the lonely in families. This is what he does. He leads out the prisoners with singing, but the rebellious live in a sun-scorched land. This is what God does. Who are the prisoners? Well, those who are living in loneliness and isolation. He puts those into families. But who are the rebellious? Those who say, well, I don't need anybody. I can do it on my own. I don't need relationships. Man, that's a sun-scorched land. It never lasts. Paul writes to a young pastor named Timothy, and he says this: anyone who does not provide for the relatives, and especially their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Man, if you're not taking care of those people in your household, if you're not doing what God created you to do as he put people together in families and into community, if you're not taking care of that, it's really hard to be a believer. You're worse than an unbeliever. That's the worst thing that you can do. Why? Because you're going against God and what he designed for us to live in community with one another. So I want to go back to words of Jesus, the ones that we heard just a few moments ago that John read for us. And I love this. Jesus is getting ready to go to the cross. He's getting ready to leave the earth. And he has these beautiful words that are so deep and so profound and yet so simple. Listen to what John chapter 16 says. He says, I've told you all these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. Man, that is good news for all of us today. And really, it describes two totally different ways of living. There's really sort of two boxes you can live in. You can live in the world box if you like. I'm in the world. That's where we live. That's where we breathe. That's where we hang out every single day. But if I want to live in the world box, what comes in the world box? Trouble, right? We just read it. In the world, you will have trouble. Trouble comes in the world box. Anybody give a testimony about trouble? Anybody faced any trouble in your life? Anybody not faced any trouble in your life? Maybe we should do that negatively. Everybody, that's what you get in the world. We have trouble. That's what it is. Nobody goes through life unscathed. In the world, you will have trouble. But in Jesus, there's another box. Thanks be to God. There is another box. In Jesus, what do we have? Everything. Specifically, peace. What did I just mention? In the world, you'll have trouble. In me, you'll have peace. Man, which box do you want to spend your days in? Man, I got enough trouble. I don't need to spend any more trouble in the trouble box. I can bring up enough trouble of my own. I want to be in the Jesus box. And I would love to say today that, man, I live every day of my life in the Jesus box. I desire to live every day in the Jesus box. But boy, there are times I like to hop off into the world box and get dragged back into trouble again. And maybe some of you have felt that same thing. And so rather than boxes, sometimes I think the better way to look at this is a tension. That we live in between these two things. We live on one side is the world, and on the other side is Jesus. And so it's like the line in between these two things that is split between these. And what you need to think about is, where am I on that line? Where am I on that continuum between in the world and in Jesus? And frankly, I hope today that we at least set our direction and say, I want to move more toward Jesus. I've experienced enough loneliness. I've experienced enough trouble. I want to be in him. And so I just got a couple of questions that I want to ask you today. And you can answer these now. You can reflect on these in the afternoon. You can take your lifetime if you want to, thinking about these. I think these are great questions. So in light of this, God, what can I do? What can I as an individual do with this chronic problem of loneliness? How can I be a minister of loneliness? How can I be a minister of reconciliation and help to gather people back into community? What can I do? And the reason it's blank on your outline there is I don't know how to answer that for you. Yeah, I've wrestled with this, and I thought of several things. I thought, one thing I definitely want to do is I want to take one step closer toward Jesus. Move away from in the world and move closer toward Jesus, because I need more peace in my life, and I want to do that. I'm not sure exactly what that looks like, but I'm going to do more of that, and making an intentional step in the direction toward Jesus. And maybe some of you can say amen to that and say, that's what I want as well. Or maybe this morning you can ask yourself, God, would you give me somebody today, before I walk out the doors today and go to my car and go out to lunch and spend time with the family, do whatever you're going to do today. Man, would you give me somebody that I need to interact with, somebody who maybe is feeling lonely, and let me be a minister of loneliness to them, and let me come inside their life? Would you open up my eyes and give me that one person? I don't need to connect with the whole world, but I can connect with one. Would you give me that? Maybe that's what you can do. And the other question then, frankly, is what can we do as a St. John community? Whether you're a member here or not, what can we do as a whole body of believers? And I thought, man, one of the great things that we can do is why don't we just model what it looks like to be in community with one another? I mean, wouldn't it be nice that we have an environment where everybody is welcome, regardless of their spiritual maturity level, that everybody is welcome? Regardless of their age, and everybody is welcome. Regardless of their political affiliation, everybody is welcome. Regardless of their ethnicity, everybody is welcome in this place. That we just model that kind of community, that everybody is welcome in this place. One of the things that we have a team of people studying right now is how best can we care for people in St. John. And one of the first tasks that we did as a small group is we're going to study best practices. So let's find some churches that are doing this really, really well and ask them, how have they done this? And so out of the ones that I've called, the predominant answer that I get back from them is probably 95% of the pastoral care concerns that we got are addressed in small groups. Man, that's where the primary care happens. Because this is great in a large community, but man, when you have a small group around you that knows you and that you can call on, and that when you need help or you need support or you need an encouragement, you need prayer, that they are right there for you because they know you, that's a much better approach to ministry than having one person serve as a minister of loneliness. But that is all of our job. And so I thought, man, what can we do? How about we get more people in small groups? That would be I would love to have everybody be connected in a small group. And next week, we're kicking off our signups for grilling groups, which is a small, short-term commitment to small groups for those who have never been involved in that before. And so if you're not and you're feeling like, yeah, I'm on the outside looking in, come back next week and the week after as we do signups for those grilling groups. Or maybe some of you are like, I think God is calling me to be one of those ministers of loneliness. Let me lead one of those grilling groups so I can invite people to be a part of a community of believers, and so we can encourage one another and give people a chance to experience what that's like. Because I tell you, we worship a God, if you didn't know this already, this is what the gospel message is about, that God didn't leave us alone. God didn't leave us in loneliness and isolation. He could have. In our rebellion, in our brokenness, God could have left us alone, but he said, no, I've got a better plan. How about I come into the world? And I'm going to die in your place. I'm going to take your shame and your guilt, and I'm going to take all of that on myself, that you don't have to, that you can be reconciled to God, that you don't have to live alone, that you can live with God, and the Spirit of God can live inside of you because Jesus died and he rose again. That is a wonderful message that we have. That's what the message of the cross is. This is what the early church committed to, that we are going to love one another because we don't want anybody to be alone. We don't want anybody to feel isolated, that we don't want anybody to feel the crushing weight of loneliness. And I tell you, nothing brought more joy to my heart this morning after the 8 o'clock service. One of our prayer partners came and said, I just got to tell you, this lady came to me and at the prayer time and said, can you pray for me? I'm feeling that bone-crushing loneliness, and I don't know what to do. And she said, I'm so glad she came up and prayed with me, because I got a chance to pray with her, but I also got a chance to connect with her and help her get connected as well. And I thought, what a wonderful gift. And if you are here today and you're feeling isolated or alone, I want to encourage you to go and check out our welcome booth or our Next Steps table, or find somebody around you and just share that. It's okay to be lonely. It's just not okay to live there. Man, we want you to get engaged and get connected. There's a God who calls you and loves you, and there's people around here that would love to love you as well and let you experience that love of God. That's what a body of believers does.